Hello and welcome to Archaeology 101. Today's topic is particularly dear to my heart, and that is why the long barrows of early Neolithic Britain were abandoned. So let's provide some context. What is going on during this period called the Neolithic, and what is a long barrow even? Long barrow is just a tomb, which you can see on the far right there, which is Bieler's Nap, and they usually come in either earthen varieties or they come in stone-built varieties. These are called Cotswold 7 type long barrows, and they tend to have an entrance in the front, although interestingly Bieler's Nap there has a false entrance. It actually has several chambers in the side of it, but generally they'll have a single entrance at the front, maybe one at the side, and this is where the early Neolithic people brought their dead to inhume them within chambers within the barrow itself, and they would have done that for generations. And I will show you in the next slide where this long barrow culture comes from. Long barrows probably originated in continental Europe about 5000 BC, maybe in south, east or central Europe. However, British barrows, they probably came from ideas spread from Western France and Iberia, and these long barrows began about 4500 BC and a little bit later, and they were spread to Britain about 4000 BC. And these continue to be constructed for about 500 years, sometimes later. Sometimes you find them sort of in middle Neolithic period, about 3400 BC, although they are quite tricky to date. But there are certain clusters around Britain which are very well known. So there's the Cotswold group of long barrows, which are in Gloucestershire, Wiltshire and Dorset, which you can see in the southwest of Britain. There's a large cluster of black dots there. These tend to be the stone-built monuments. You also get a lot of long barrows, again constructed of local stone, in Orkney, and you can also see there are patches all over Britain, and they do proliferate all over Britain, and they come in their various different styles. Not all of them are stone built. Some of them are earthen, some of them are made with timber as well, and some of them have many phases as well, and they are constructed over continuously, and I'll go into that in a little bit. The Neolithic period in continental Europe started about 5500 BC and ended broadly around 2400 BC. Long barrows were then brought over when the Neolithic began in Britain about 4000 BC, almost 6000 years ago. Before 4000 BC, the inhabitants of Britain were probably hunter-gatherers during the Mesolithic period. But with the introduction of long barrows also came agriculture, and people started to produce crops such as emmer wheat, einkorn, and they started to herd cattle, pigs, and some sheep as well. There may have been a profound cultural and maybe religious change as well. Perhaps these long barrows and the people within them were worshipped, and this word ancestral cult has been thrown around quite a lot. So the idea there being the deceased within the tombs brought power and maybe even prosperity to those who inhumed them. Dependent on the type of long barrow you have, you can access human remains for many hundreds of years, over generations. So the picture in the bottom left-hand corner, that's an example of a Cotswold 7 style long barrow made out of stone. And that tomb may have remained open for hundreds of years for dead to be brought to the chamber, but also taken out as well, and perhaps brought to other monuments in the landscape, such as the causewayed enclosures, which are these big ditch monuments generally in prominent areas of landscape such as hills, and they may have been, the dead may have been brought there at certain times of the year and put on display. And this toing and froing, bringing bodies in, taking them out, it jumbles them up and produces this big mass of human bone, which you can see in that picture on the far right hand corner. And there are some theories that it might even have been deliberate to anonymize the ancestors. Not all these long barrow features are stone made, there are wooden examples, and that central picture, which is Cat's Brain, which is from Wiltshire, that may have been one of these wooden temporary long barrows. There were no human remains found from this feature, so it may be that the human remains were taken away, or perhaps the human remains were only there for a certain amount of time and they may have been put back into a stone long barrow instead. There are other theories on long barrows that they weren't solely for putting the deceased away in, but they might also have served as territorial markers, as many of them, particularly in Gloucestershire, are in prominent locations, such as on top of that Cotswold escarpment. So if you clear away any trees, you can see these really well across the landscape, and this may have displayed to other groups that this is our territory, don't come here. There's a very convoluted history of long barrows. The data from long barrow excavations predominantly comes from the 1800s, where records were quite scant, to say the least, if they were even made. Excavations didn't tend to improve in their quality until people like General Pitt Rivers in the late 1800s came around and started to set down some proper precedents for how an excavation should be conducted so that you can get some better quality data. All of these excavations and research have been pieced together, and we have a pretty good idea of what long barrows were like and how they were used. One thing that we do know is that long barrows weren't always static in their design, and they could be remodeled over time. So if you look in the bottom right hand corner, there's Wayland's Smithy, and that had two phases. There was an initial barrow where human remains were placed, and then an earthen mound was placed over the top of them. So those human remains could not be interacted with again, which is not what we've seen in other examples. But then later in the life of Wayland's Smithy, a long mound was constructed over the top of it, as you can see there in green, and a Cotswold 7 style chamber was inserted in the front. So now those human remains could be interacted with again, and more could be put in and more could be taken out. Long barrows were used for about 100 to 500 years, dependent on the barrow, so they could be used for a very long time, and presumably by the same group of people. But around 3,500 BC, 3,300 BC, many long barrows were abandoned, and some were actually even blocked up. And you can see examples where limestone, for example, has been used as almost a wall, so no one could enter that long barrow again until they were excavated down the line. However, interestingly, long barrows seem to have intrigued people even during the later prehistoric period, and you'll find later beaker, which is Bronze Age period pot. You'll find Roman and Saxon burials even, and they seem to have been incorporated into the mythology or folklore of people all through history and prehistory. What was happening at the end of the early Neolithic for these long barrows to have been abandoned? Some scholars have suggested that there were worsening climate conditions, and due to these poor climate conditions you could no longer grow cereal crops. And the idea here is that most of the diet of the population of Britain is coming from cereal crops. If they can't grow them, they have to go and eke out an existence as pastoralists, maybe even returning to hunter-gatherer lifestyles, but the population may have taken a decrease here. People such as Shannon and Bevan, they've used the proxy of the number of sites in Middle and Late Neolithic as markers of population. So they suggest, Bevan et al. In 2017, that there were fewer Middle and Late Neolithic sites than there are in the Early Neolithic, and therefore they say fewer sites means fewer people. I really don't agree with this at all, and I think if anything it just shows that there was a big cultural shift. Just because there are fewer pits in the ground doesn't mean that the population has taken a sudden decrease. There are very good examples of disease in Neolithic Europe. Pneumonic plague, for example, has been discovered as far west as Scandinavia, and that probably came from Asia. So perhaps a pandemic swept through the continent and may have arrived in Britain and may have caused a mass destabilization of the population, meaning that they had to change their culture completely. There is no evidence for pneumonic plague in Britain, but the skeletons of long barrows are not very well, they've not been looked at in great detail. So I would be interested to see if there is evidence of some sort of virus to have incurred around the end of the early Neolithic. But at the moment, there is no evidence for a pandemic in Neolithic Britain. There may have simply been a cultural shift, meaning that we've got these new ideas which may have come from Iberia, for example, which we know Iberians replaced the hunter-gatherers in the beginning of the early Neolithic. Maybe another population came in with ideas which were just better than long barrows, and therefore long barrows were surplus to requirements. If there was such a replacement, there doesn't seem to be wide-scale conflict. There's certainly small-scale conflicts happening around Britain at the time, and again, long barrows are a really good repository for showing interpersonal violence. Scholting and Wysocki in 2005, for example, demonstrated that there were cranial trauma in quite a few individuals, but nothing to suggest a wide-scale slaughter. However, I will show in the next slide that conflict was part of Neolithic Britain. Besides these small amount of cases of cranial trauma in long barrow victims, there is one example of an actual Neolithic battle, and that is the Battle of Crickley Hill. Crickley Hill is a causewayed enclosure in Gloucestershire, and it was built around 3700 BC. Slightly later in its life, about the end of the early Neolithic period, a defensive rampart was constructed, and in 3450 BC a conflict occurred. Hundreds of arrowheads were found across the site, and internal wooden structures in the causewayed enclosure were burned down. Shortly after this conflict, the causewayed enclosure was actually abandoned. This is really interesting, but I don't think it shows that there are wide-scale conflicts across Britain. It just shows that there were small skirmishes, probably between warring tribal groups, rather than an invading army sweeping across Neolithic Britain and causing a massive cultural shift. If you think the ending of the early Neolithic is mysterious, then the entire Middle Neolithic period completely trumps that. And I'll just begin the Middle Neolithic with this chapter from Vicky Cummings' book, The Neolithic of Britain and Ireland, where she talks about the Middle Neolithic. In many ways, the Middle Neolithic is the least understood phase of the Neolithic, overshadowed either side by the architecture and material culture from the start of the Neolithic and the large and impressive monumental complexes and rich material culture sets that appear in the late Neolithic. The Middle Neolithic is a quiet period lost somewhere in between. So what she's getting at here is that the early and the late Neolithic periods have the research focus. None have really been put on the Middle Neolithic because they don't have, during this time, large monuments. I do strongly disagree, however, that the Middle Neolithic was a quiet period, and I'll demonstrate why. There is very limited monument use during the Middle Neolithic period. This is true. Certain older structures are continued to be used during the Middle Neolithic, such as the causewayed enclosures and long barrows, but they are mostly abandoned during the Middle Neolithic period. In fact, older designs from the early Neolithic period are continued into the Middle Neolithic. So there are cursus monuments, for example, which originate in the early Neolithic, but they are predominantly used during the Middle Neolithic, and these are these long rectangular enclosures often found by rivers, which is interesting, and it's suggested that perhaps they're meeting places or territorial markers, and you find the same sort of artifacts you would anywhere: pottery, animal bone. They don't appear to be directly correlated with burial, at least not many burials are found at cursus monuments. That's not to say that they didn't have some mortuary function. Round barrows are used to some extent during this period. Doggleby Howell, for example, in Yorkshire is a quite commonly cited example, but it seems that flat inhumations are more preferred during this period, whereas the communal monuments of early Neolithic Britain, these are individual burials. There are some examples of multiple burials, but they tend to just be simple, singular individual burials throughout the landscape, often associated with settlement. There are hengiform monuments built during this period, so these are sort of a prototype for the henge monument. So they're a circular ditch feature, and they're fairly small, and you can find examples of these across Britain as well. Occupation in the Middle Neolithic amounts to pits, and pits are found throughout the Neolithic period, and they are especially prolific in the Middle Neolithic period, and this amounts to all the evidence we have for occupation during this time. Houses in Neolithic Britain are very rare. We do have a few examples from the early Neolithic, but essentially no examples from the Middle Neolithic period, and perhaps people had chosen to use things such as mud bricks or teepees or tents or lean-tos, which have very low impact on the archaeological record, so we can't really see what they are living in, but the remnants they leave behind are things like pottery and animal bone and the occasional charred hazelnut. But we can see that they are indeed consuming quite a lot of animal products and leading their animals around the landscape, perhaps more so in the Middle Neolithic than in the early period. They also do have a tendency to bury individuals near their settlements as well, but perhaps they're also cremating a lot of their deceased people too, because the bodies during the Middle Neolithic period are not as prolific as they are in the early Neolithic, so there might be an emphasis on cremation, or they are disposing of their dead in a way that we can't see in the archaeological record. Let's recap what we've learnt here. So there are very good explanations as to how the early Neolithic began in Britain, how the continent provided long barrows and agriculture, but when all of this ended, no one seemed to have any explanations or any good explanations for why and what was happening later. This narrative is changing now, thankfully. There's clearly a massive cultural shift. Megalithic construction isn't really happening, but monuments are still being built. Monuments which are still used in the early Neolithic are used. Ideas of monuments which were conceived in the early Neolithic are used in Middle Neolithic. Fresh monuments are constructed, such as the Cursus monument, such as the hengiform monuments, which provide that prototype for the later henges. People are still being buried, of course. It's just not as communal, they're not as overt, they're being buried in flat burials, and perhaps they're just being buried or disposed of in cremation or in another way we just can't see. They must be being treated in just a different way. And this is possibly explained by a high level of mobility, a higher level of mobility than in the early Neolithic. People are taking their animals and perhaps they're moving around landscapes at a much more rapid rate, maybe because they don't have cereal crops to look after. I don't know how true that is. I just don't think we have especially good evidence at this point that states that they were tied to a landscape by crops. They were able to move around the landscape untethered by the long barrows, so they weren't tied to a landscape because of their ancestors. But that doesn't mean that they didn't leave a fair few impacts on the landscape, such as the monuments that I cited. Thank you very much for watching this video. I will, of course, as usual, leave the figures and the sources in the description below as well, so you can go ahead and read all of those. If you have any questions, please leave a comment, and I'll see you next time on Archaeology 101.